Good afternoon. I'm Amrit Jainam, and I'm a Markets Development Advisory Specialist at the Office of the Markets Development and Public-Private Partnership at the Asian Development Bank. I'm delighted to welcome you all to the deep dive workshop on mobilizing capital for clean energy transition. The theme of ASIF 2024 is accelerating the energy transition and ensuring energy security and affordability. Today being the Energy Finance Day at ASIF, we are looking forward to this important discussion on how to mobilize capital for clean energy transition. Without further ado, may I request Ms. F. Cleo Kawawaki, the head of ADB's Office of Market Development and Public-Private Partnership, to deliver the opening remarks.
Thank you, Amrit. Okay, so which one of you had a good lunch today? Okay. Oh, good. That's nice. Because, I always like our guests to have a nice lunch. And, these sessions right after lunch kind of worry me because if you had too good of a lunch, you get a little sleepy. And if you didn't have a good lunch, you're kind of grumpy. So good to hear. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming to this session on mobilizing capital for clean energy transition. I'm Cleo Kawaki, head of the Office of Market Development and PPP. A lot of people ask us, what does market development mean? And I'd like to tell you, I don't know yet. But what we define it as is where there is a market gap, we try to fill it. And energy transition is definitely a place where there is a market gap. So it is one of our most exciting areas of engagement. So well, we've seen the battle against climate change is a global imperative, but we've seen it right at home too. I think we felt it this season, we felt it last summer. And one of the most, emitting items on our list is the coal-fired power plants. And this, in Asia Pacific, we have a lot of them, and we have a lot of the younger ones. So, if we are seriously thinking about trying to stay, inside the 2-degree warming to save our planet, this is definitely somewhere we have to really be working on. So while there has been significant steps taken by the countries and the financial markets to not get new coal-fired power plants going in the Asia Pacific, that's not going to be enough. We really need to speed up the retirement or repurposing of the existing coal-fired power plants. Mostly these are on long-term contracts, and we really need to replace them with clean energy sources to reduce the emissions. Based on the pre-feasibility study we did in 2021, Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam alone, the three of the largest coal consumers in ASEAN, coal-based power makes up 3,030 gigawatts of capacity. And early retiring of half of these, which was going to take a hell of a lot of money, $30 billion, but this will result in emission reductions of more than 2 gigatons of carbon equivalent. And what does that mean in terms that we can that I can understand? It means 55 million cars off of our roads. This is the equivalency that we see. Or, the other way around would be we can plant 2 billion trees. But this is the magnitude of what we would be able to do if we could retire half of these plants. And this is the scale of the challenge. It's really big, and we need scalable solutions. So today's workshop will feature presentations and a panel on different initiatives, including ADB's Energy Transition Mechanism. We launched ETM in 2021, and this is focused on transitioning from fossil fuel to clean energy while reducing emissions across Asia Pacific. In simple terms, the ETM program will mobilize public concessional capital and private sector concessional and commercial capital to provide financing solutions, which will be aimed at lowering emissions through early retirement, repurposing of coal-fired power plants, and unlocking new investments for sustainable and renewable energy. Okay, ADB is frantically working on pilots for ETM in Indonesia and the Philippines. And additionally, we are actively collaborating with Pakistan and Kazakhstan while exploring opportunities in other countries to get this market going. Presenting on ETM will be followed by overview of the fund vehicle that ADB has structured to support this crucial initiative. Well, this is really difficult. And successful implementation of ETM hinges on being creative, on the art of the possible. I mean, we can't really, looking at the market right now, you can't see money floating around to do this $30 billion job. But with financial instruments, including concessional loans, commercial loans, mixed with grants, and even mixed with new instruments like carbon credits, all of these put together, we believe that this can be done. Our distinguished panel of experts brings hands-on experience in clean energy transition. Dr. Pierre Horma, yes, thank you, from United Nations Economic and Social Commissions for Asia and Pacific will share insights on just energy transition in Asia. He will walk us through the key success factors for energy transition projects. And next, we'll hear from attorney Glenda Lea Karinga. No, where's she? Oh, there she is. Hello. Okay. Representing the Power Sector Asset Liabilities Management Corporation. She will discuss the early retirement of the Mindanao coal plant and the planned development of utility scale solar plant to replace the retired capacity. We'll have Sharad Somani from KPMG will provide the transaction advisor's perspective. He'll delve into the expectations of commercial lenders and investors in the context of clean energy projects. We will also explore potential of carbon credits to attract private sector investments with Ajitrandi Priyambondo from ADB. We will conclude the workshop with discussion on how to scale up clean energy transition and create a sustainable future for our region. Thank you again, and I look forward to your active participation in discussions. Off with the show.
Thank you, Cleo, for sharing your perspectives on the topic and sharing your insights on how big the challenge is. And now may I request Mr. Rahul Gupta, Associate Partner, McKinsey & Company, to deliver a presentation on accelerating the energy transition away from fossil fuels.
Good afternoon, everyone. I think in the morning, the context has been set on about how we could accelerate the energy transition from fossil fuel. So I think, as it was said earlier, right, the world is not on a 1.5 degree trajectory. We're looking at more 2 degree trajectory. But like moving towards clean transition is inevitable, right? And doing this in Southeast Asia context is very challenging. And the reason has been highlighted in the session just before, right? So if you look at the global emissions, 50% of those emissions happens in Southeast, in Asia. If you look at the amount of money which is needed, right, I think was talked about 30 billion just for coal. But if you look at the overall investment needed for Southeast Asia, we're looking at about 400 billion USD annual investment to just reach the net zero target, which the countries in Southeast Asia have committed to. Now, power being one of the important sources of energy consumptions, and one way to decarbonize the power sector would require significant uptake in the renewable energy sources, right? So today, Southeast Asia has about 30 gigawatt of installed capacity of solar and wind, but to achieve that net zero aspiration of about 1 terawatt hours, we would need about 7 to 12x increase in the annual capacity additions from now till 2030. I think moving forward, we talked about coal as one of the key things. Coal globally results about 21 gigatons of total emissions, and Southeast Asian or Asian countries needs about 60 to 70% of the energy needs coming from the coal-fired power plants. And I think energy transition away from coal presents an additional complexity. I think some of these were highlighted. Most of the age of the coal plants are less than 15 years of age, which means that we are looking at a significant portion of plants which would need to be early retired. Second, I think is there is a strong inertia from the coal to early retire coal plant because there's a lot of money which has been invested and sitting with the project owners which they have not recovered based on these plants. And third, I think the region still needs a lot of energy demand based on the rapid urbanization, the population growth which we are seeing in the country. So what can we do with the coal plants, right? So what we have seen is there are various approaches which have been taken globally. So using co-firing with ammonia on biomass for coal plants. We're looking at CCS retrofit. We're looking at repurposing the coal plants to move away from base load to a peak load and potentially early retirement. Now, if you go to the initiatives which are currently being done for early retirement, most of these are being undertaken as part of the Just Energy Transition Partnership and the ADB ETM mechanism. The core of this is largely the blended finance, which is bringing in the private and public money together. There has been significant progress, but what we see is an insufficient amount of concessionary capital available to finance these things, right? So together with MAS, what we have done is we basically published this paper which looked at how we could use transitional credits to accelerate the early retirement of coal. What do we mean by transitional credits? So it's basically the credit which is generated by early retirement of the coal plant and replaced by renewable projects. So in this paper, we basically interviewed a lot of the reputable organizations as you see on the page here and crafted 4 big chapters, right? So first really looking at what is the economic gap, right? What is the gap which needs to be filled or financed? Second, how transition credit could be used to meet that requirement. What are the challenges which the financing companies are facing to overcome or which needs to be overcome to finance these early coal retirement plant? And what could be one of the potential structures to look at? So maybe just to explain the chart, right? So what we see here is trying to identify what is the economic gap which is out there, right? So the first bar on the top, the financing need, is assuming the PPAs of the existing coal plants. What is the net present value of those PPAs today, right? The second bar below talks about what if we do an early retirement. So there is a gap which is still remaining, which is that economic gap, right? And what this paper has explored is looking at how we could use carbon credit as a more market-driven and commercial mechanism just to finance that economic gap. I think given the credit requirement, I think we look at both from demand and supply, right? So from a demand perspective, we see 5 big key buyers, and the demand potential is somewhere around 3 gigatons of CO2 emissions by 2030. Right, so the big buyers are the corporate buyers who have committed for voluntary purchase of voluntary carbon credits just to meet their requirement. And second big player would be the domestic government just to meet their decarbonization goals. But these credits could also be used by corporate for their compliance setting as well as international agencies like Corsia. When we look at the supply, right, I think interviewing some of these carbon exchange institutional investors, there were 3 problems or 3 challenges which were being highlighted. The first one was the lack of established standards, right? And hence developing a credible methodology, which I think we are seeing a lot are underway by ADB, by Gold Standard, by South Pole, World Bank, just to address that credible methodology. The second problem we are seeing is the public perceptions and reputational risk, right? So, and to address that, I think the critical thing required would be ensuring that these carbon credits have high integrity in line with the CCC principles. The third big thing, challenge is the timing mismatch and future validity, right? So how can we ensure that there's a sufficient transparency given to the investors on the project timelines and there is no project delays? I think talking about the integrity, I think as part of the paper, we did explore how the transition credits or how early retirement would be able to meet some of the principles as laid out on the CCP. So I would not go into all of these details, but I think the critical ones are the additionality, the permanence, right? And in the way to ensure additionality, right? So as I mentioned earlier, all of these projects required economic gap, right? And hence it meets the bar of the additionality. The permanence is important because it's important that these plants are fully decommissioned and it's not resulting back in the CO2 emissions. And hence those things would be required just to ensure that these credits can be of high integrity. I think generating and selling of this carbon credit can help bridge that economic gap which we're looking at. But it requires additional financing mechanism just to fund these institutional investors or these operators, right? So one such mechanism could be blended finance, where the public money could be used to help de-risk the project or increase the returns so that for a private investors, it's able to meet the bankable requirement. But others we were looking at was more on the challenges which we face for a transitional credits here, right? So how do we ensure that the projects actually gets decommissioned in the time when it's being announced for, right? The second challenge we're looking at is the risk of the returns, right? So are we able to secure the carbon price at the carbon credit at the price we want, and there is no additional decommissioning cost as what we had planned in our business case. The third is whether it is aligned with the net zero commitment which the banks have to support this transition. So one possible structure we had looked at was transitional SPVs. So what we say is we could repurpose the SPV to have these PPAs coming in from the power plants, the PPAs coming in from the renewable projects, which could be set as a collateral for these transitional SPVs for financing. And then you could look at additional new investment sources like concessionary capitals or new equity investors who may be willing to put in money to make this work. I think the last thing which was covered before, right, it does impact about 6 million people in Asia Pacific who are somewhat related to working on the coal value chain, right? So I think what is needed is that as we think about project execution, we ensure that there is a robust assessment of all the negative impact and those are properly mitigated. There is a monitoring mechanism in place to ensure that these mitigation processes are being well tracked and there are enough insurity to provide that these are properly financed. Again, I think we talked a lot more about the actual transitional level where the investors, the institutional players would need to come in to transact these. But beyond these, we required host of public and private participation, leading from the market levels to national levels, each having a specific roles for them in helping us achieve these energy transition. And an orchestration would be needed to ensure that everybody is aligned to meet that overall goal of early retirement of coal plants. I'll summarize my presentation and in terms of path forward, what I see is that I think we heard there are two projects which are in pilot phase, which we'll hear more in a panel discussion later. There are multiple organizations who are willing to come forward and support this energy transitions. And there are ongoing conversations, especially in the hard to abate sectors like cement and steel. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahul, for sharing your insights. May I request Mr. Dionisio Camangon, Senior Markets Development Advisory Specialist from OMDP, to discuss ADB's energy transition mechanism.
Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm here to cover developments within ADB's Energy Transition Mechanism program. And we'll zoom in into the activities around the setup of the third-party fund vehicle that will take to scale this initiative beyond ADB's own resources. I think some of you have seen this same slide, so I'm not gonna dwell into this further. This is just to contextualize where we are in terms of the energy transition. A lot has been said on how coal-fired power plant has contributed significantly in using up the carbon budget globally. And while developed countries have done their share to reduce that dependency on coal-based power, we see that some of our member countries are still in the process of doing so. And it is really ADB's initiative to try to support our member countries in their transition goals towards achieving lower dependency on coal-based power. Again, probably another familiar slide, what we call the chocolate and matcha cake. This gives us, visually what is the challenge we're facing, where if we do not retire coal capacity in our region, the potential for green renewable energy to replace them is facing a significant challenge. So maybe to contextualize this, what would it take for us to go from chocolate cake to matcha cake? As what Cleo has mentioned, for 50% of the capacity within the early focus countries that we're looking at, that's a 30 billion financing gap. Right? So for us collectively to be able to address the challenge, multiple solutions, multiple interventions needs to be planned and done collectively. This just gives you visually what ADB has done for its part in trying to mobilize capital to enable us to undertake energy transition projects within the region. So we started in 2021 when the ADB initiative, ADB ETM initiative was launched, and we received 25 million seed financing from the government of Japan. This was built on with a lot of the work done together with the Indonesian government, where in 2022, the Indonesia ETM country platform was launched, and the first pilot was also announced. In parallel, additional donor capital was also received from the government of Germany for 30 million euros. And in COP28 last year, additional progress was also achieved, where the government of New Zealand has also agreed to contribute $25 million for the ETM initiative, as well as the Memorandum of Understanding signed with the Singapore government and the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet to actively work on the development of a third-party platform of up to $2 billion that will take to scale ETM transactions. Again, maybe a familiar slide that we have seen during this week. This gives you the overview of the ADB ETM program. Think of it simplistically as ADB's using its resources and know-how to try to crowd in partners from public concessional, private commercial capital into different interventions that we can assist to accelerate the early retirement within the region. So there are three key thrusts of this activity from ADB right at the middle. We are in the process of setting up the funding vehicle, which we'll cover later. Additionally, ADB itself is using its own balance sheet to do direct transactions into energy transition type of project. And lastly, we are mobilizing resources to provide technical assistance and grants to our member countries to enable them to undertake activities and studies that they would need to progress on the policy side, as well as some of the grid level work that they need to undertake. So we just double click here onto the funding vehicle that we are working on. As I mentioned earlier, this was announced in COP 2028, where ADB has signed on to partner with the Monetary Authority of Singapore as well as the Global Energy Alliance for People and Planet to launch the 2 billion fund for energy transition. Now, what does this fund mean and what it will do? The fund itself will be a third-party vehicle that will try to mobilize capital from private sector to come into this early step into the early energy transition process. ADB and its partner, for its part, will crowd in concessional capital into the vehicle, with the idea being that this concessional capital will be able to provide some risk-absorbing mechanism that then unlocks some of the bankability concerns that the private sector is facing in investing into early transition projects. As I mentioned earlier, the ambition is $2 billion to begin with, but we don't expect to stop there. Right? The idea is this $2 billion will enable us to undertake some of the pilot transactions to demonstrate the value additionality that this setup could do, and to replicate that and build on successes from earlier transaction. Again, reiterating some of the messages earlier, from our early study, the gap itself is at least $30 billion, and it's probably growing as the demand in our member regions are increasing. And this $2 billion is the step towards building towards that overall target for all of us. Where we are in the process, we are working with the partners to firm up what will be, in simplest terms, the rules of the game in which this funding vehicle will operate in. So we are working with the ecosystem to define what will be, for example, the asset selection criteria, what will be the key operating metrics in which this platform will look towards in terms of selecting which projects are worthy of investment. We are also in the process of developing already a pipeline from our engagement with our member countries as well as with sponsors, so that this platform will be able to hit the ground running the moment it's operationalized. And lastly, we are in consultation with the private sector to really identify what is the cost of capital, what is the returns expectation that they're willing to put forward to join us in this endeavor. I think one of the challenge of this activity is that from a purely private sector lens, it's always risk versus reward. And as you can see from the entire initiative, there is significant risk and uncertainty that energy transition is facing. And if we rely solely on a financial model that tells us this is going to be X% return to meet that level of risk that they are undertaking, I think that's a non-starter, right? We all collectively need to look forward to see what is the overall value such an energy transition initiative can bring both to each of our own portfolio, but broader than that, into the overall initiative, globally in accelerating the energy transition. Thankfully, even within the regulatory sector and the accounting sector, there is a move to understand that, right? How we look at carbon financing today, how we look at energy transition today in terms of how it impacts our balance sheets, our P&L, that itself is evolving, right? How the regulators are looking at what type of transactions a financial institution can take in terms of correlated transactions, those are also evolving. I think that collective effort by the ecosystem to enable us to unlock capital to come in here at an affordable and reasonable return, such that we are able to do as many transactions as possible, is really what we are all aiming to do with this vehicle. So just again, zooming in a bit more onto the details of this. So earlier we've shown that this vehicle will look at coal retirement or carbon reduction transaction as well as clean energy acceleration. So for the carbon reduction facility itself, we'll look at accelerating the retirement through bringing value addition to address the economic gap of early retirement. I think as some of us are familiar, at the heart of a carbon reduction transaction is a retirement of a productive asset. That means value is being destroyed or lost, right? Now, as much as we all say it's a shared pain and everybody must share the pain, when we start asking who's willing to take the pain, nobody's raising their hand. This is the reality of the challenge that we're facing. So now, rather than asking people who's willing to take the pain, we have taken initiative to see what can we bring in terms of value to help replace that value that is being lost. And that's really where the financing solution for the carbon reduction facility would look at. We look at some creative financial means to do this. One of the possibility is through cost of capital arbitrage. What does that mean in terms of numbers is that most of these plants are existing and operating, but most of them have also delevered. So there is an opportunity to relook at that cost of capital balance within these plants and see whether some value can be unlocked through financial mechanisms such as what we are envisioning under ETM. This can be done at 3 levels. It could be equity or pseudo-equity under an acquisition model. It could be project financing under a synthetic model, or it could be corporate level under a portfolio model. So all of these are potential structures that we're exploring. In addition to this, which is outside of the slide, we're also looking at potentially mobilizing carbon credit, as what Rahul has covered earlier, to provide us that additional capital to offset the economic gap that we're facing. I won't go through this detail because some of these have been covered in the morning, but in substance, what this shows us is how multifaceted and how many stakeholders we'll need to manage to actually get this done. As I said in the morning presentation for this, the numbers part is the easy part of this energy transition mechanism discussion, right? Getting the financial models is something that we all can work towards, but getting alignment of positions, alignment of interest from a multi-stakeholder type of engagement, again, with the mindset that this starts not with building something. I think building something is easier for people to accept. Unfortunately, what we're facing here is we need to take out something before we can build something. And that's a more layered conversation. And that's really where a lot of the work has to be put into as this funding vehicle moves towards getting the buy-in of all the stakeholders. Lastly, we just wanted to double click onto how the replacement renewable energy can come about. We've heard that there are multiple clean energy funds out there. Unfortunately, deployment of capital has been difficult because projects have been lacking. So that's one potential bottleneck that the funding vehicle will look to address, and something that we believe is a value proposition to the private sector to work and invest with us, right? The funding vehicle will look towards project preparation. How do we work with our government clients to develop bankable projects that can then be taken to scale in terms of the clean energy side of the equation? As I mentioned earlier, the funding vehicle will have some level of concessional capital that it can deploy in different means to provide some sort of risk absorption or risk mitigant, so that the private sector is able to develop structures that will be more bankable and more projects can be undertaken at scale. To enable this or to seed such transactions, the funding vehicle itself will be co-investing into this project with the private sector. The idea being to crowd in rather than to crowd out, so that investment or staple finance coming in from the funding vehicle will be a portion of the total financing need, allowing us to mobilize even beyond the capital of the vehicle itself. So I'll pause here for now, and I think there will be a lovely discussion that will follow during the panel, and happy to take questions or even over coffee later. Thank you.
Thank you, Dion, for sharing your insights on the energy transition mechanism and the fund vehicle. We can now proceed to the panel discussion. So let me make a short introduction of the moderator and the panelists before I request them to come on stage. The panel moderator is Mr. Siddhartha Bhaskar Shah. He's the Director of the Advisory Division 2 at OMDP at Asian Development Bank. And the panelists are Attorney Glenda Leah A. Karengal. She's a department manager for the Contracts Administration Department of PSAM, which is the Power Sector Assets and Liability Management Corporation of the Philippines. We have Dr. Pierre Horna, who's the manager of the Financing Energy Transition Project at the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. We have Mr. Sharad Somani, Partner and Head Infrastructure Advisory and Energy, KPMG. And we have Ms. Arshit Randi Priyambodo, Senior Energy Specialist at ADB. So may I request all of you to come on stage.
So let me add a warm welcome from my side. I'm delighted to be in front of this distinguished panel. Looking forward to a lively discussion. So let me first turn to Pierre. Maybe you can set the scene here. How ready is Asia to undertake this energy transition? And what do you think are the critical factors or ingredients to mobilize capital which is necessary for this transition?
Thank you very much, Shah, for this. And I would like, first of all, to thank ADB for the kind invitation to the United Nations Regional Economic Commission for Asia Pacific, ESCAP. Very happy to be here for the first time. As the ESCAP Secretariat has put forward this new work stream on energy transition financing, which, of course, it's very important for the region. In terms of your two questions, because I have only 5 minutes to set the scene, I just would like to follow up on the latest remark of the colleague from the ADB. He just talked today to everybody. He said, numbers, financial modeling are all there. What about the vision? What about the political willingness? And what about the alignment between the different actors within this energy transition process? We have seen that, for instance, at the JETP processes in the two countries in Asia Pacific, Vietnam and Indonesia. We have seen that in different scenarios within the region. Therefore, I would like to come and follow up on this particular angle. And that is precisely what the UN Commission on Asia Pacific will be doing with this new project that we are launching for the Asia Pacific region, particularly focusing on the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. So we have seen in terms of the latest developments, lots of advancements in the Asia Pacific region when it comes to the de-risking assessment of the cost of capital and the access of capital for different stakeholders. Perhaps this is much more markedly in different clusters of countries. As we go in this region, we can perhaps divide the assessment into 4 different clusters. The first cluster will be the more advanced economies of the Asia Pacific region, where there is still, of course, there is still heavy dependence on coal, but at the same time, a very important RE investments. And I know, and everybody knows, which country I'm talking about that constitutes 60% of the coal RE investments in the world. The second cluster are those countries where there are middle-income economies, emerging markets. At the same time, we are looking at high reliance on coal. And that, of course, will lead us to a specific type of risk assessments, particularly those that are focusing on the ETM. Actually, these 3 countries that the ETM process is focusing are precisely the second cluster of countries I'm talking about. The third one is more about the Pacific Islands. I think we know what are the specific constraints of the Pacific Islands in terms of the energy security issues and the way in which the reliance on oil is actually happening. And finally, the fourth cluster is more about the LDCs, or the less advanced economies in the Asia Pacific region, which they are looking at how the risking mechanisms are applicable to these middle-income countries, middle-income high countries, some of them, of course, being G20 member states, and that could also be an important a lesson learned. So we have seen then cost of capital as one of the areas that are critical for the Asia-Pacific region, and the perceptions as to which investors are looking at it. Of course, the sustainable finance mechanisms, and that's coming from our latest report on sustainable finance, the Financing for Development report of last year was published in October last year at ESCAP. We heard from the member states when we published it how important is the relationship, but not the direct correlation of investing on specific banking and capital markets, meaning developed capital markets, and sustainable capital markets. So we have seen that in some LDC countries in Asia Pacific, this is not a direct correlation. And that's a very interesting finding of this report. And maybe if there's a question on that, I can explain more better what is the case study we found on a specific LDC country right across the border here. So in terms of the sustainable debt instruments, there is a high demand, and I think a colleague from American McKinsey already said, of existing from green sustainability-linked bonds. Of course, there has been a decline on SLBs, as you could see in the latest numbers, due to greenwashing considerations, due to the sustainable finance ecosystems that are not directly in line with what investors would like to see, and I may refer to a specific example. Then there's also, in terms of the lending markets, there's a trend in green, sustainable, and sustainability-linked lending. However, as you can see in our latest research, out of the 500 commercial banks in Asia Pacific, only a very little percentage have really committed to net zero, and that is still a back problem for the region in terms of the readiness, as you usually say. Now, private finance, it's going towards renewable energy. We have seen the presentations today on private finance, mini-grid and off-grid financing. We have seen lots of case studies in LDCs as well, Bangladesh and others. I think this is a good development. There is a need, of course, to refocus on and increase investments on blended finance. I think the issue of blended finance, as ADB has said in previous discussions throughout the morning, connects with the idea that more and more LDCs are ready to do that. The perceptions are there, the high-level perceptions of investors are there, but of course, there's a need always for multilateral development banks intervention, as they have a very good, important rating agency. So carbon pricing, we've looked at it already, and how to implement carbon pricings, particularly in those very important countries that are not ready, so to speak, to decommission their young coal plants. One of the main issues that we have seen is how this strategy can actually be complemented with a whole-of approach towards the decommissioning of early coal CFPPs, and that is in connection to the session in the morning where we talked about the ETM mechanism. I think that there's still a lot of room for improvement in many Asia-Pacific countries when it comes to a country approach towards the early decommissioning of coal plants, which is not connected to other types of export revenues that are important for the same country. So there is, in terms of coal transition, there's financial institutions that are, of course, working on this structure in this strength, and of course, the small ticket projects that we shouldn't underestimate that. Today, we received a very interesting discussion on SMEs financing and the importance of base community transition projects on small ticket projects. And I think this is a critical example because many of the PPPs do not take into account that, and DFIs do not take into account that. And unfortunately, all the importance of the legal frameworks adopted in PPPs can actually be lost because of the lack of, let's say, concrete interventions on these small ticket projects. And by the way, even a G20 member state will actually back up this vision from this particular point. So just to finalize, I have 1 minute. We would like to say one word in terms of what we have in terms of our main recommendations. I think 4 different areas we have looked at in this new work stream on energy transition financing. We talk about a stakeholder's vision, and that leads to the point that you said earlier in terms of reorganized the vision towards energy transition financing by the line ministries in the Asia Pacific region. There are specific type of considerations that needs to be creating more bridges between the visions that they have towards the same problem. You have, of course, domestic markets and local currency investors needs to be encouraged in this particular area because of the de-risking mechanisms that are important. The strengthen the regulatory and policy environment to support the efficiency execution of these policies. And finally, the financing the managed phase out, as I said, while increasing RE investments. I stop here then for this first introduction. Thank you.
Thank you. So Sharat, it is not easy. There are divergent views. In fact, people may say there's a cacophony of voices, views, and opinions. So can you tell me from your vantage point, what are the key concerns of the various stakeholders, and more importantly, how one can go about mitigating and addressing those?
Wonderful. Thank you, Sid, for the question, and pleasure to be here. And thanks, Rahul and Dion, for setting the right stage for this panel. So, Sid, to respond to that, and we have been working on ETM with ADB, the different stakeholders, as you rightly highlighted, have to work together. The primary goal for any energy transition has to be potentially based on addressing the energy trilemma, as we call it, right, which is energy security, affordability, and sustainability. And if you look at it, it actually is in that order. To the utility and the regulator, I think security is most important. Security and availability of power is paramount. And Southeast Asia particularly is on the cusp of growth, right? We're the fastest growing region with youngest population. And without energy, it's not going to be possible. So I think asking somebody to retire plants without having a viable option is not going to fly. The second is, of course, affordability, right? Fact of the matter is, in spite of renewable energy and solar hitting rock bottom prices, we still do not necessarily have on an equivalent basis a grid parity, right? The solar on its own can be cheaper, but solar with battery not necessarily as yet. And finally, I think sustainability is key, and that's why the clean transition that we're talking about will be important. The way we look at it, the financing plan, and that's where I guess most of the stakeholders we're talking to are looking at it, is probably correlating it with, let's say, the COP28 announcements, right? The 3 big takeaways from COP28 to our mind was looking at first tripling the renewable energy, right? And that's a big target, and of course that was highlighted in the presentation as well, and that's going to be an important focus going forward. The second is doubling the energy efficiency from what we achieved last decade, and that's a very, very important initiative. It is not necessarily considered very exciting to do it, but that's something which we have to do across hard to abate sectors going forward. And third is, of course, moving away from fossil fuel. Now, if you look at it, all 3 have to happen together because there has to be a demand side measures. So energy efficiency is a demand side measure which has to improve. There's a supply side measure of having renewable energy coming up at a pace and at a quality that we can replace the coal plants, and then only we can move away from fossil fuel. So I think coming from the utility regulator perspective, they're looking at the broader growth of the economy. And if you look at the growth plans of Indonesia, Vietnam, they have substantial renewable energy capacity additions envisaged, right? If you look at the sponsors, they're definitely keen to move away from coal, right? And they want investment avenues in other plants. So one of the discussions we are having is what happens to the capital recycled from moving away from coal? Where does it get invested, right? And you've got to offer those opportunities for them to invest in, right? And this is where I think the CRF and CEF that Dion talked about is very, very important. It's not only about retirement of coal plants, but also effectively replacing it with equivalent energy, the clean green energy. And this will only ensure that the first part of the energy trilemma, which is the energy security, is addressed effectively. And I think the third aspect, which is very, very important, I think we should not forget, is the energy transition. And we talked about the number of livelihoods that depend on on the coal ecosystem or the fossil fuel ecosystem. I think it has to be a gradual phase out where we not only ensure that polluting fuel is taken out of the system, but the livelihoods which are dependent on these jobs, from the mining to the transportation to the actual coal power plant, are actually repurposed, retrained to be able to take on new jobs and new just transition effectively happens to them as well. So these are probably the big three impediments, as I would say, from the stakeholders, which need to be addressed as we try to achieve our clean transition goals.
So let me follow up, Sharad. I think, in your response, I think you kind of touched on how the public sector and private sector, all the stakeholders need to work together to mobilize capital. So how can they come to work together specifically to mobilize capital, and what role you think platforms like what Dion spoke about, ETMFV, JETP, and other initiatives which are going on, what role can they play in terms of the scaling up of capital, mobilizing capital to accelerate the energy transition?
Yeah, no, a very important role. In fact, one of the key buzzwords in the whole of COP28 was blended financing. And the reason they call it blended is because nobody is ready to compromise on the commercial returns expectation of private sector. So effectively, we are hoping that philanthropic capital will come and subsidize the capital that commercial is not able to give to clean energy projects. Now it is what it is, right? And we have to respect what commercial financing is going to go towards. What it means is the philanthropic capital has to come in. But philanthropic capital may be cheaper, but it's not a blank check, isn't it? We need to give the impact returns to the philanthropic capital. And this is where the platforms like what we are planning on ETM vehicle are very, very important, because these are the platforms which will ensure that the projects are structured right, there's a fair bit of due diligence done. The impact on the environment, on the society is properly documented and ensure that it is made to happen. And the transition credits that we talked about is very, very important, right? We are committing to closing down plants 10, 15 years down the line. There has to be a very strong institutional framework and governance to ensure that that indeed happens. Because a fair bit of capital is being put up front with the hope that the carbon abatement will happen 15 years down the line. And institutions like multilaterals, ADB, World Bank will have to play a very, very important role to ensure that whatever is committed today actually is followed through and that impact is created. So I would suggest that these platforms will become very, very critical, and the entire governance framework will have to be so very robust that everybody can trust the system to rely on it. And in that regard, I think the pilot transaction that we talked about is very important. It may take a bit longer to close it, but once we close it, I think all those loopholes and governance frameworks will be so very robust that future projects can happen much faster, is my sense.
Okay, thank you, Sharad. Now let me move on to Chitra. So Chitra, of course, blended finance, philanthropic capital, MDB capital, it's part of the solution, yeah? Given the scale of the issue here, we need to come up with innovative solutions and kind of bring new ingredients in the mix to kind of bake this cake. And Rahul spoke about carbon credits as one of the possible ways of doing that. Can you speak a little bit more of carbon credits, but more broadly about carbon markets? What role can they play in this energy transition journey?
Yeah, thank you, Sid. Thank you for the questions. So like the carbon market, like any other market, is driven by the supply and demand. And of course, the competition and the competitive pricings. In terms of the demand, so how is the demand created? Basically, the use of the carbon offsets of credits, it doesn't directly contribute to the emission reduction itself. However, along with the raising awareness of the climate change and also like raising awareness of the climate ambitions of the countries and also companies, so they established certain targets, climate ambition targets. However, they don't have like enough, in certain cases, they don't have enough funding or facilities for investing itself in the reduction technology for countries or for the companies or for certain regions. So in this case, this is where when this investment, like direct investment, is too costly, this is where the demand of carbon can be created. On the supply side, the selling carbon credits would, of course, generate additional revenue stream for the activities that reduce emission itself, to increase the economic and financial viability of the project itself, and to scale up the efforts in transitioning to lower emission technology. For example, the transition credits that Rahul have talked about, and also Dion has also explained about the early retirement of coal-fired power plants through ETM. The carbon credits that could be potentially generated under these early retirements of the CFPP, and not only from the early retirement of the CFPP, but the replacement with the lower carbon technology, could also help the scale up the investments on the cleaner energy to replace this coal power plant. Additional revenue stream also to invest, and also to help the just transition activities. Recently, this carbon credits and the supply of carbon credits has recently get a bit like negative backlash because of the credibility and integrity. In terms of to get a higher integrity, we also have seen that Rahul have already spoke about the initiative of the transition credits. Mainly when we talk about highly transition credits, we really need to to ensure that these credible carbon credits can be generated through good standards and methodology. And this is how where ADB is now working also in developing a new methodology, and also working with other methodology developers, for examples like a Clean Coal Initiative that have submitted the methodology to Vera, and we also have a discussions to gold standards, so that we can try to map, the pilot transactions of this early retirement of coal power plant to use a standard methodology. And when this methodology is already approved, that is when we can say that, okay, a certain high integrity carbon credits from early retirement of coal power plant can be generated. So I think I could stop there.
All right, thanks, Chitra. Lastly, I will turn to Glenda. So she's this one person in the panel who's not only talking the talk, but actually walking the walk. So PSAM is actually working on a pilot project for early retirement of coal power plant. So Glenda, can you share some information to the audience, kind of give an update and a sense of where the project is?
Okay, so the Philippine government has an existing agreement with a private entity for the construction and operation of a coal plant. And under the agreement, the private party would own and operate the coal plant, while the government would purchase the plant's electricity output over a cooperation period of 25 years. At the end of the cooperation period, the ownership of the power plant will be transferred to the government. And this BOT agreement also provides for a buyout option for the government to purchase the private entity's interest in the coal plant ahead of the cooperation period. And that is the agreement. And last year, the government approved the commencement of the privatization activities for the coal plant under the Energy Transition Mechanism privatization structure. And this ETM privatization structure would involve the early retirement of the coal plant after the buyout, and subsequent repurposing or replacement of the coal plant with clean energy. The ADB is actually assisting the government on this project. And based on our current timeline, we hope to commence the early retirement of the coal plant in 2026, 2 years from now.
So Glenda, if I can have a quick follow-on question on that. And you hold an interesting position, PSAM holds an interesting position that you're an owner of an asset and also you're a government entity. And often this question comes is that, why doesn't government go start retiring coal power plants? Because the case for it is so compelling. Can you, and I know it's not that easy being a government official, so I wanted to kind of get a sense from you, when you look at an asset like you have, what are the key kind of deal makers or breakers, when you look at this? Yes, what are the things which you as PSAM as an entity is looking at, or what are the things, maybe if you may put yourself in the shoes of the government or DOE or DOF, what are the things which they are thinking about before making a decision like this?
Yes. I think as a government-owned and controlled corporation, PISAM has keener regard for government policies because we are also a government entity. So important matters like energy security and conservation, this also find their way into our decision making. Even though we are in the mandate of privatizing assets, these are also considerations for us, especially since our principal is the Department of Finance and the Department of Energy. But even though we are a private entity, we are just like other private sponsors. Even though we are a public entity, we are also like other private sponsors. We do not really have a seat at the table, and well, even if we do, it's probably a very small seat in a really big table. So, but like other sponsors, we also consider the financial viability of transactions. So bankability and risk allocations also find their way into our decision making.
So thank you very much. We are running out of time, so I'm just going to do one last lightning round. Everybody has 30 seconds to a minute, no more than that. So if there was one thing which you think can be done in a time frame of 12 to 24 months, what is that one single thing you would choose to unlock this energy transition conundrum we have?
30 seconds then. We haven't talked about the NDC investment plans within the UNFCCC process. I'm part of the UN, so I have to talk about this in 30 seconds. I think this is a great opportunity for Asia Pacific to incorporate and articulate, as the Executive Secretary of UNFCCC has said in several occasions, and currently they are meeting in Germany as we speak. What he has said and what the member states have said, that this is the best opportunity to articulate climate finance, energy transition into the new NDC 3.0. He doesn't even say NDC, he says investment plans. So let's take that type of rhetoric. And that will lead to many of the things we're talking about, meaning cross-cutting an integral view from the government towards energy transition processing and its financing, because you need credible transition plans for the private sector to come in. That will also lead to work together with stakeholders. We have two very big actually, platforms in the UN, which is the UNDC, the NDC partnership and the UN Climate Promise. Both of them are working together. And I think member states, particularly, not only and beyond the Ministry of Environment, which is the focal point for these processes, should work together. And in this particular area, ESCAP has a role to play, and I think we will continue working on that in cooperation with ADB. Thank you.
My one ask, hope, expectation for the next 18 to 24 months, I guess, is investment in marginal technologies. I believe for us to achieve our aspirations, only technology can save us. The reason why solar took off is because the solar technology really came to help in terms of reduced prices and increased efficiency. My sense is if governments, multilaterals, blended financing can go towards marginal projects, whether it's in green hydrogen, ammonia, battery storage, bioenergy, including potentially CCUS and other stuff. I think we have to be bold enough to start investing in these technologies over the next few years, and the proof of concept will happen, and hopefully that will help us save and achieve our objectives.
Since I've talked about carbon credits, maybe I try to state of what I think it's important for it to be operationalized. First, well, maybe not one, maybe two. So first is the approved like methodologies to operationalize carbon credits, especially for the transition credits. And the second is basically the necessary instruments from the government itself to operationalize the compliance market, follow the Article 6.2 market of the Paris Agreement. I think that's most important.
I think for the Philippines, at least, it would be additional transmission facilities. There is a lot of interest in the private sector to invest in renewable energy. However, our transmission facilities, our existing transmission facilities cannot keep up with those additional power generation. So I think this is something that really we can work on within the next 2 years.
Thank you. Actually, just on time. So it's wonderful. I mean, NDC 3.0, new tech, UNCCC methodology, compliance market, and transmission. I think that's a fantastic summary of your wish list. I'll turn to Amrut. Do we have time for any questions from the audience? Okay. Please go ahead. Can you just quickly introduce yourself or just tell, from where you are?
Yeah. I'm Rakesh. I'm based in Hong Kong, advise green investment funds on due diligence aspects. Thank you for sharing your experience and your wisdom. There's a two-part question to ADB and to UN SCAP. There was a slide which spoke about the carbon reduction approach and the clean energy topic. On top, there was a rectangular block saying government partners. So I'm curious, based on your experience, who are these government partners? Is it Ministry of Energy only? Or is the Ministry of Health also coming forward and saying, oh yeah, with this transition, I will end up saving some costs, so I want to pitch in some of my money? Is it Ministry of Nature, Biodiversity who's saying, I will have to save some money? Or are these ministries saying, oh, don't talk about reducing my budgets, yeah? So no, keep me out. And the second part, you mentioned from UNESCAP, you have reviewed the banks in the region and only a small amount of them have transition goals, let's say, or net zero goals. How about the insurance companies and the reinsurers? Maybe the insurance companies don't want to lose out that high amount of premium from coal, but what about the reinsurers? They should be happy, right? To pitch in, to give some donation, philanthropic. Are you observing that or not? Thanks.
Thank you for your question. As you know, UN works directly with governments, no? These are our first clients. So within governments, in this topic, we normally have our sort of natural partners, government partners, who are the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Energy. Both of them. Already in there, if you go throughout the countries in Asia Pacific, you might see that there are different visions within this process, on these line ministries. So there is the first challenge that we need to sort of address when it comes to working with these government partners. Because you cannot have a whole of government approach if the two line ministries might have diverged views on the same topic. And that's exactly one of the first reports we're going to issue very soon under this project on energy transition financing, which will address focusing and featuring 3 countries in Asia Pacific, in Southeast Asia, Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. So that is in terms of the critical government partners. But as I said earlier, if you go a little bit in the wider picture of climate action, you have the Ministry of Environment, which are, of course, the focal points for the UNFCCC process in Bonn and wherever they meet around the world. However, inside there are some areas of communication. And I understand, here we have the Filipino government, I understand, and we're gonna meet tomorrow, actually, as we speak, with the Department of Energy and the Department of Finance with the Philippines and the Climate Change Commission. Now, I understand already that there is a sort of like a task force looking at the same issue in a comprehensive way. And that is already a good example, a good case study that we can draw from the Filipino example towards the rest of the region. Because it doesn't happen naturally when it comes to government partners. Now you mentioned the insurance part. Perhaps I should mention that the other aspect of this project is our approach towards decommissioning coal plants under the JETP and beyond the JETP processes. And when we talked about this, we are talking about also working with insurance companies, because if they stop these processes of reinsuring or reinsuring the coal plants, I think we can actually have the way forward in there as well. And we haven't really approached this from this perspective. And this is one of the things innovatively that we're gonna work together as we speak in this first report that will be issued in a couple of months from now.
Yeah, hi, Jean-Marc Champagne from Seneca Impact Advisors, also based in Hong Kong. Good to see the Hong Kong representation here. So my question is kind of a comment and a question, I guess. But I heard some talk about needing the blended finance and getting the foundations and philanthropic capital involved. Before I started up my own firm, I was with WWF, working for the Dutch Fund for Climate Development for the Asia Pacific region, and it was a very good blended finance mechanism. But I'm finding that it's really difficult to get the foundation and philanthropic capital involved. They say they want to do this stuff, but they're starting to act more like investors. They kind of want their capital back, so it's getting really difficult. And the big problem I see is that there's plenty of money out there. What is not there are good quality projects. So the question really is, it's more of a comment, but the question is, how can we address that, getting more very early stage capital in to get these projects up to where they're actually investable? Because right now, it's really difficult to get them to that stage. Thanks.
Okay, no, that's a good point. In fact, if you look at the broader philanthropic capital base, we have got on $9 to $10 trillion available, as per some statistics. But you can't unlock it just because they want to be good corporate citizens or good citizens, right? And we have actually done an extensive study with both family offices as well as philanthropic capital on how to mobilize that capital, unlock that capital for potential investments in climate projects. The key thing that comes out is, how do you quantify the benefits, right? It doesn't have to be benefits or returns in terms of ROI, the return or IRRs, but more in terms of what is the social impact, what is the environmental impact you are able to create. And unless you have a very robust methodology to convince them that indeed their capital is going for causes that will move the needle, that capital is not going to be unlocked. There are a fair bit of bilateral capital we work with, which can take early project risks as well. But I think unlocking that capital of philanthropic capital, which is hard-earned money, and they are very successful businessmen who want to now deploy it for good causes, they will really ask you tough questions. And I think we at our side will have to be ready with those frameworks, those methods to quantify the benefits and deployment to ensure that they can come on board. So it's a process. I think we're just getting started.
Okay, one last question. We got many hands up, but I think we are available after this, so we'll be happy to answer this question. But just, yeah, maybe the lady.
Thank you. I'm from Vietnam. Yeah, and I think that my question may be relevant to a lot of emerging markets, in the room. So I'm sitting in the Sustainable Finance Committee of the European Chamber of Commerce in Vietnam. And right before this trip, we organized a roundtable on the sustainable finance in Vietnam and the region. And one of the very outstanding topic we touched in the discussion was, now a lot of, sustainable finance, I mean, in Vietnam and emerging market, the money is there, but the banks find it a bit reluctant to move in because there is a lack of, or even absence of the complete regulatory framework to really set up a platform on this. And the governments in those emerging markets, actually, they don't know how to do it. They don't know where to start. So my question is, what's your view in terms of the role of the multilateral agencies or bilateral agencies in helping the government to set up such a regulatory platform? Because without the proper regulation framework, the bank scene cannot really move in. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. That leads me to the second objective of this project, because precisely Vietnam is one of our beneficiary countries. Indeed, there is a lot of uncertainty when it comes to regulatory framework, especially in some basic issues, for example, of formalization of technical foreign assistance, where there is a widespread of regulatory frameworks that they have to jungle in these different government units. And that is a situation that is jeopardizing a lot of funding that is available, not only from the donor countries, which I know there is a lot of funding waiting to be executed for your country precisely. Yep. And of course, that delays and relays all these processes that are coming in. So it's not a question of funding. And I think the other colleague said also earlier from Hong Kong that there is no question of funding. Net zero commitments by banks will not commit to anything when there is nothing concrete coming from the government in terms of credibility and the financial plans. So we are tackling this from the perspective of ESCAP, the UN Commission on Asia Pacific, by, for example, promoting workshops directly addressing the government officials, but not only those officials that are working on, for example, let's say, connected to these topics, but also the legal officers, those that are actually outside this process. They just look at the end and say, oh, but we don't have a framework for that, let's stop all this process. So by the way, we have a good technology, we have a good PPA, we have everything funding, but then a legal officer said, this is not correct, because whatever you have done doesn't have the legal mandate that we need. So therefore, and I think this is important, we are addressing this problem by a multidisciplinary approach, by putting lawyers, bankers, and engineers together. And that's precisely our members of the team working together. And me, myself, I'm a lawyer, so that's where I'm not afraid of working with legal officers themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, thank you.
Can I also? It's just that in addition to that, in fact, like in ADB, we also have the modalities of kind of like policy-based lending, where that this lending is against the policy actions, where these policy actions can also support the government in putting up the certain instruments related to the scaling up, enabling a private sector investment.
Yeah, thank you, Chitra. I think, I mean, ADB is willing to help in these matters. With that, I'm afraid we have run out of time. So let me just thank the panel one more time and a round of applause for them. And thank you.